She collapsed at the feet of the Alpha King's greatest enemy. Every warrior in that courtyard reached for a weapon at once. Steel came out of a dozen sheaths in the same breath, moonlight catching on drawn blades, and for one long second nobody moved, because nobody could quite process what they were looking at. A woman, barely conscious, sinking to her knees in the packed snow of enemy territory, and in her arms, wrapped in a torn gray blanket, two newborns who had no business being there at all. Then the impossible happened. Both infants released a scent into the cold night air, and every wolf standing in that courtyard went rigid, because that scent belonged to two bloodlines that had been at war for longer than most of them had been alive. The Alpha King, standing at the edge of the crowd with his own personal guard fanned out behind him, stopped breathing entirely. His hand, halfway to his sword, simply froze there, suspended in the air, like his body had forgotten what it was reaching for. His enemy, the man who had spent the last decade trying to burn his kingdom to the ground, stepped forward and placed himself directly between the collapsed woman and every blade in the courtyard. "Touch those children," he said, voice low and absolutely without mercy, "and you'll have to kill me first." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And somewhere in the back of that stunned crowd, an old woman who'd served 3 generations of this court whispered a single word that would end up mattering more than anyone in that courtyard could possibly have guessed. Impossible. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd genuinely love to hear from you. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss one of our upcoming stories. Here's what nobody standing in that courtyard understood yet. Not the guards with their weapons still half raised. Not the Alpha King, frozen at the edge of the crowd like his own legs had betrayed him. Not even the woman bleeding into the snow, barely holding on to consciousness. What was happening in that courtyard wasn't the beginning of a story. It was the ending of one that had started years earlier, buried so deep that almost nobody left alive actually knew the truth of it. But we're going to get there. Stay with me. The scent hit the courtyard again, as one of the infants stirred, and this time, there was no mistaking it. Warriors who had spent their entire careers learning to read bloodlines by smell alone stood there shaking their heads, 'cause what their noses were telling them made no sense at all. One child carried the unmistakable mark of the Ashmore bloodline, the Alpha King's own line, ancient and singular, a scent that had never once in recorded history mixed with another. The second child carried the same mark, but layered underneath it, impossibly, was the scent of Draven blood, his enemy's bloodline, the two most powerful and most bitterly opposed royal lines in the entire Western territories, somehow both present in these two small, sleeping infants. It shouldn't have been possible. Rival bloodlines didn't blend like that, not even in mixed parentage children. The magic simply didn't work that way. And yet there it was, undeniable, filling the courtyard air, and every wolf present understood without being told that whatever they were looking at broke rules that had held steady for centuries. The Alpha King finally found his voice. "Explain this," he said, and though he said it to the crowd at large, his eyes never left the woman on the ground. Something about her face, pale, thin, older than her years should have made her look, was tugging at a memory he couldn't quite place, and that unplaced memory frightened him more than the scent did. His rival didn't answer. He simply knelt beside the woman, checked her pulse with a gentleness that startled everyone watching, given the man's reputation, and lifted her, along with both children, into his own arms. "She needs a healer," he said, "now, or none of your questions will matter, because she'll be dead before you get your answers." Nobody argued with that. Even the Alpha King, staring at his sworn enemy carrying an unconscious woman and 2 impossible children toward the healer's quarters, found he had no words left to object with. The infants, cradled against a stranger's chest, chose that exact moment to open their eyes. Every wolf in that courtyard who caught a glimpse of those eyes went still all over again, because the twins' eyes weren't the color of either Alpha's bloodline. They were the color of something older, something that, according to every record either kingdom kept, had gone extinct 3 generations ago. Nobody in that courtyard knew who this woman was. That's the part that made everything so much worse. She had no name that anyone recognized, no mark of allegiance on her clothing, No bloodline scent that matched any registered line in either kingdom's territory. Just an exhausted, malnourished Omega woman who had somehow walked, or been carried, nobody was sure which yet, across enemy lines while carrying two newborns whose scent alone was enough to restart a war that had gone cold 7 years earlier. The healer who examined her that first night, an older woman named Wyselda, who had served the Draven line for 30 years and had seen more battlefield wounds than she cared to count, came out of that examination room looking shaken in a way her attendants had never once witnessed. "She's been abused," Wyselda said quietly to the small group waiting outside. "Badly. Old scarring, some of it years old, malnutrition, and her body." She stopped, choosing her next words carefully. "Her body has been through childbirth before. Twice. These aren't her first children." That detail landed hard in the room, and nobody quite knew what to do with it. Word spread through both territories within days, the way word always does when something this strange happens, twisted a little more with every retelling, until by the time the story reached the outer villages, some were calling her cursed, others calling her a spy, a few of the more superstitious elders insisting she must be some kind of omen sent to punish both kingdoms for the war they'd waged against each other for the better part of a decade. Nobody, in those early days, asked the obvious question: where had she been for the past several years? Because the truth, and this took considerably longer to surface, was that this woman had vanished from recorded existence almost 4 years earlier. Not died, not fled to some known location, simply vanished, so thoroughly and so completely that even the most thorough search parties from both kingdoms had eventually given up and assumed the worst. If this story already has your heart racing, let us know in the comments. Tell us you're watching, because we're only just getting into what actually happened here. To understand any of it, you have to go back. Further than the courtyard, further than the collapse, further even than the pregnancy nobody knew about. You have to go back nearly a decade, to a time before either Alpha King wore a crown, before the war, before any of the hatred that would eventually consume both kingdoms had taken root. Back then, they weren't enemies. They were something far more complicated. Allies, brothers in every sense but blood, raised together for a stretch of their youth when a fragile peace treaty between the Ashmore and Draven territories had briefly allowed both young heirs to train side by side under the same masters. Kael Ashmore and Roran Draven had hunted together, fought together, and by most accounts genuinely trusted one another in a way neither had trusted anyone since. Nobody quite agrees on what broke that friendship. The official histories from each kingdom tell wildly different versions, each one painting the other side as the betrayer. What both versions agree on is this: something happened during the final months of that alliance, something involving a woman both young men had cared for deeply, and by the time the dust settled, the fragile peace between their territories had shattered completely, and the two young men who'd once trained together as brothers had become the bitterest of enemies. That woman's name, buried in records that almost nobody bothered to check anymore, was Leora. Nobody at court remembered her clearly. She'd been minor nobility, an Omega with no significant political weight, the kind of person history simply forgets to mention once the people around her become important enough to matter. What almost nobody knew, what had been deliberately, carefully hidden, was that Leora hadn't disappeared from both young men's lives by accident. She'd been forced out, threatened, manipulated, and eventually driven into hiding by someone who understood exactly how much damage her continued presence near either bloodline could cause to certain very carefully laid plans. That someone wasn't Kael, wasn't Roran either, and uncovering exactly who orchestrated it all would end up taking most of this story to fully unravel. For now, all that mattered was this: 7 years after that friendship shattered into a war that had cost both kingdoms hundreds of lives, Leora, the same woman both young alphas had once loved in their own complicated ways, reappeared at the edge of enemy territory, carrying twins with a bloodline that shouldn't exist, and neither Alpha King had the first idea how any of it was possible. Because here's the detail that took the healers, and eventually both kings, entirely by surprise. When Leora finally regained consciousness 3 days after her collapse, weak but lucid, the first thing she said wasn't an explanation. It was a question. Did you find the third one? Nobody understood what she meant, not the healers, not the guards standing watch, Not even Roran, who had barely left her bedside since the night he carried her in from the courtyard. There had been 3 children born that night, 7 years ago. Only 2 had survived long enough to reach the courtyard alive. Before we go further into what that means, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything. The hidden pregnancy, when the full story finally came out, was more complicated and more painful than anyone had guessed. Leora had discovered she was carrying children during the final, chaotic weeks, before the alliance between Ashmore and Draven collapsed entirely. A period so consumed by mounting political tension that almost nobody at either court had time to notice one quiet Omega woman growing increasingly withdrawn and afraid. She told almost no one. The 2 men who might have been the fathers were, by that point, barely speaking to each other, each one convinced the other had betrayed him in ways that went well beyond anything involving Leora herself. She made the decision to disappear before either of them found out. Not out of cruelty, and not because she didn't care for either man. Quite the opposite, actually, which was precisely the problem. She understood, with a clarity that must have been agonizing, that whichever man learned the children were potentially his would use that fact as a weapon against the other. The children would become political currency in a war that hadn't even fully started yet, and she refused, absolutely refused, to let that happen to them. So she vanished, with help. And this is where the mystery deepens considerably. From someone inside the Ashmore court, who arranged safe passage for her out of both territories entirely, into a small, forgotten settlement, far enough from either kingdom's reach that nobody would think to look for her there. Nobody at either court ever discovered who that helper was. For 7 years, it remained one of the deepest, most carefully guarded secrets tied to the entire affair. And uncovering that identity would eventually crack open the whole truth of what actually happened. But that reveal is still a long way off yet. Life on the run wasn't kind to Leora, and it wasn't kind to her children either. She gave birth alone, in a small cottage on the edge of that forgotten settlement, attended only by a local midwife who asked no questions and kept no records. 3 children came into the world that night. Triplets, something so rare among wolf bloodlines that even seasoned healers, upon hearing about it years later, would insist it had to be some kind of mistake in the telling. The 3rd child, a girl, survived only a handful of days. Leora never fully explained what happened, not even years later, when pressed gently by people who genuinely cared about the answer. Some losses, she would eventually say, simply don't have words attached to them. Whatever happened, the grief of it followed her through every single year that came after, quiet but constant, like a wound that never quite finished healing. The 2 surviving children, a boy and a girl, grew up in hiding, moving from settlement to settlement whenever Leora sensed searchers getting too close, which happened more often than anyone at either royal court would have guessed. She raised them alone, with no name to give them beyond the ones she chose herself, no lineage to claim, no protection beyond her own vigilance, and whatever kindness strangers along the way were willing to offer a struggling mother and her 2 unusual children. Because the children were unusual. That much became clear early. By the time they were 4 years old, both twins had begun displaying abilities that shouldn't have appeared until well into adolescence, if they appeared at all. The boy could sense danger before it arrived, a kind of early awareness that had saved their small household from discovery more than once. The girl, stranger still, could apparently calm any wolf's rage simply by being near them, a gift so rare that the few people who witnessed it assumed at first they were imagining things. And the scent. That was the detail Leora feared most, because no matter how carefully she masked it with herbs and careful distance from other wolves, both children carried a bloodline signature that was unmistakably, impossibly, both Ashmore and Draven at once. She'd spent years half convinced she was imagining it, some trick of guilt and exhaustion playing on her senses. She wasn't imagining it, and she had absolutely no idea how it was possible, because as far as she knew, only one man could be their father. She simply didn't know which one. For years, that uncertainty haunted her more than the running ever did. If this story has you hooked, let us know in the comments. Tell us you're still watching, because we're just getting to the part where everything starts to unravel. The unraveling began, as these things often do, with a mistake nobody could have prevented. The twins were 7 years old, living in a quiet settlement, 3 territories removed from either kingdom, when the boy, startled badly during a thunderstorm that rattled the small cottage they were staying in, shifted for the first time. Far, far too early. Wolf children rarely shift before their early teenage years, and even then, only under careful supervision. A full, uncontrolled shift at 7 sent a surge of raw wolf energy through the surrounding territory that every trained wolf within a significant radius felt instantly, like a bell tolling across the entire region. Leora knew, the moment it happened, that their years of careful hiding were over. Search parties from both kingdoms picked up the signature within days. Neither side knew exactly what they were chasing. Rumors had circulated for years about a woman and children connected somehow to the old feud between Ashmore and Draven, but nothing concrete, nothing anyone had taken seriously enough to properly investigate. This changed that instantly. Both territories mobilized search efforts, each one racing the other, neither fully understanding why finding this particular family mattered quite so much, only that it clearly did. Leora ran. Of course she ran. She'd been running for 7 years. Running was the only language she still fully trusted. But she was exhausted in ways that went beyond simple tiredness, worn down by nearly a decade of vigilance with no rest. And her body, it turned out later, when the healers finally examined her properly, had been failing for longer than she'd let herself admit, weakened by old injuries and years of insufficient food, and constant, grinding fear. She made it as far as the border of Draven territory before her legs simply stopped working. The rival reached her first. That detail mattered enormously, though nobody understood exactly why yet. Roran's own search party, moving faster and with better knowledge of the terrain, found her collapsed at the tree line, with both exhausted children clinging to her, barely conscious herself, moments from losing consciousness entirely. Every warrior in that search party expected exactly one outcome. An unidentified intruder carrying children with a mixed and possibly threatening bloodline signature, found on Draven territory, would ordinarily face swift and merciless judgment. Nobody in that clearing expected what actually happened. Roran took one look at her face. Really looked. The way you look at someone you never expected to see again. And everything in his expression changed. Leora, he said, and the name came out of him like something he'd been carrying, unspoken, for 7 long years. Nobody in his search party understood what was happening. All they knew was that their Alpha King, feared across the Western territories for his ruthlessness in war, was on his knees in the snow beside an unconscious woman, and the look on his face bore absolutely no resemblance to the man they thought they knew. He carried her, along with both children, straight into the heart of his own territory. And when Cale Ashmore's search party arrived at the border hours later, tracking the same signature, they found the trail leading directly into enemy land, which was how the Alpha King of Ashmore ended up standing in his greatest rival's courtyard that night, watching 2 impossible children open their eyes for the first time in enemy hands, with absolutely no idea what any of it meant. Before we continue, if you've made it this far, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe, so you catch every story we tell after this one too. Cale expected betrayal the moment he crossed into Draven territory. Years of war had trained that expectation into him so deeply it operated almost without conscious thought. Every step onto enemy land was a calculated risk, every interaction with Draven wolves a potential trap. He arrived at that courtyard fully braced for an ambush, weapons ready, guard formation tight around him. Instead, he found Roran standing protectively over an unconscious woman and 2 sleeping infants, refusing to let a single member of his own court near them, without explanation. "Hand them over," Cale said, voice hard, though something underneath the hardness had already started to crack the moment he caught the scent rolling off those infants. "If they carry Ashmore blood, they belong under Ashmore protection. They carry Draven blood too," Roran said, not moving an inch. "Which means you don't get to simply take them, and neither do I, until we understand what we're actually looking at." It was, by most accounts from those present, the first civil sentence either man had spoken directly to the other in 7 years of open warfare. Neither of them understood, in that moment, exactly why Leora's face had hit them both so hard. Neither of them had connected her, not yet, to the woman from their shared youth who had vanished so completely all those years ago that both had eventually convinced themselves she must be dead. Recognition, when it finally came for each of them separately over the following days, arrived less like a realization and more like a wound reopening. The ancient archives buried beneath the Draven Palace held answers nobody expected to need. It was Uselda, the healer, who first suggested checking the old records, not out of any particular insight, but simply because the twins' scent signature matched nothing in any modern text she'd ever studied. And old problems, she reasoned, sometimes needed old answers. What she found, 3 days into a search through records so old the parchment crumbled at the edges, changed the entire understanding of what everyone was dealing with. There had been a bloodline once, generations before either Ashmore or Draven rose to power, that predated the split between the two houses entirely. A single unified line, before political ambition and territorial disputes carved it into two warring branches. The records called it the Old Blood, and according to every account Weiseld could find, it had gone fully extinct nearly 100 years earlier, the last known carriers dying without heirs during a plague that had swept through the Western territories. Except apparently, it hadn't gone fully extinct. It had simply gone dormant, buried deep enough in both the Ashmore and Draven lines that it hadn't surfaced in generations, waiting, if bloodlines can be said to wait for anything, for the right combination of ancestry to bring it forward again. The twins weren't simply children of two rival houses. They were, according to every ancient text Weiselde could locate, the first old blood children born in a century, and the prophecy attached to that bloodline, tucked into a passage so old the language required a specialist to translate properly, was unsettling enough that Weiselde debated for a full day whether to share it at all. When the divided blood runs true again in a single vessel, the old wound will either close forever, or the land itself will be torn apart trying. Nobody in that archive room needed the passage explained twice. If this story has your heart racing, let us know in the comments. Tell us you're still watching, because we're only just getting to the part that changes everything. The massive betrayal, when it finally surfaced, came from a direction nobody had considered. It started with a small detail Cale couldn't stop turning over in his mind during the long nights he spent, against every instinct telling him to leave enemy territory immediately, remaining in Draven lands to understand what was happening to Leora and the children. Someone had helped her escape 7 years earlier. Someone inside his own court, with resources significant enough to arrange safe passage across multiple territories, and the discretion to keep that arrangement hidden for 7 full years. He started asking questions quietly, carefully, the kind of questions that don't draw attention until suddenly they do. The answer, when it finally came together, arrived through Leora herself, once she'd recovered enough strength to speak at length. She remembered the face of the man who'd arranged her escape, though she'd never learned his name at the time. Young, she said, barely more than a servant, working in the Ashmore household during those final chaotic weeks before the alliance collapsed. She described him carefully, and the description landed on Cale like a physical blow, because he recognized it instantly. Not a servant, a steward's son, one who had risen over the following 7 years to become one of Cale's own most trusted advisors. A man named Corwin, who had stood at Cale's side through nearly every major decision of the war, who had, if you traced his influence back carefully enough, been present at almost every critical turning point that had pushed Ashmore and Draven further and further into open conflict. It wasn't Roran who'd betrayed the friendship all those years ago. It wasn't Cale either, despite what each had spent 7 years believing about the other. Both men had been manipulated, carefully and patiently, by someone who understood exactly which words to whisper into which ears, to turn two friends into enemies, and who had continued whispering, year after year, ensuring the war never quite found a path toward peace. Why? That question took considerably longer to answer, and the truth of it, once uncovered, was almost more painful than the war itself. Corwin's own family had been destroyed generations earlier, during the very split that first divided the old bloodline into the Ashmore and Draven houses. His ancestors had held power once, briefly, before losing everything to the two rising bloodlines that eventually became the ruling houses everyone now recognized. He'd grown up on stories of that lost legacy, nursing a grievance passed down through generations, and when he found himself positioned close to young Cale during those formative years, he'd seen an opportunity to finally settle a debt nobody currently living had actually incurred. Breaking the friendship between the two heirs was never really about Leora at all, though he'd used her as the perfect wedge, planting doubts in each young man's mind about the other's intentions toward her, until the friendship simply couldn't survive the accumulated suspicion. Keeping the war alive for 7 years afterward was about ensuring neither house ever grew strong enough, or stable enough, to reclaim the kind of unified power the old bloodline had once held. If they destroyed each other slowly enough, Corwin reasoned, there would eventually be nothing left to reclaim, and the debt, in his own twisted accounting, would finally be settled. He hadn't anticipated Leora's pregnancy, hadn't anticipated the old blood surfacing in her children, unexpected proof that the very legacy he'd spent his life avenging could still, somehow, find its way back into the world despite everything he'd done to keep the two houses apart. When Cale confronted him with everything he'd learned, standing in a private council chamber with Roran present at his own insistence, an alliance of convenience that surprised absolutely everyone in that room, including both men involved, Corwin didn't bother denying it. 7 years, he said quietly, and neither of you noticed. 2 grown men, raised together, trained together, and you let one voice in your ear convince you the other was your enemy. He shook his head slowly. You were never going to see it, because you never wanted to. It was easier to hate each other than to ask why. That confession landed harder than anyone in the room expected, because underneath the bitterness of it was an uncomfortable truth neither Alpha King could fully deny. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. The final confrontation with Corwin didn't unfold the way anyone expected. Not through open battle, but through something considerably harder for a man who'd spent his whole life manipulating others from the shadows. Exposure. Public, complete, undeniable exposure, laid out before both courts with every piece of evidence Cale and Roran had gathered between them. There was a physical confrontation eventually, when Corwin, cornered, his decades of careful manipulation collapsing all at once, attempted to flee rather than face judgment from either house. The chase that followed through the palace grounds ended not with either Alpha King landing the final blow, but with Leora herself, weakened but standing, placing herself in Corwin's path as he tried to escape through the very courtyard where her children had first been discovered. You took 7 years from us, she said, and her voice, according to everyone who witnessed it, didn't shake at all. You don't get to take anything else. Whatever Corwin intended in that final moment, it didn't matter. Guards from both territories, working together for what might have been the first time in 7 years of open war, closed in around him before he could take another step. The truth that came out over the following weeks reshaped both kingdoms' understanding of everything that had happened. Every clue that had seemed strange or unexplained throughout the years, the sudden souring of the original friendship, the mysterious, leaked information that had escalated tensions at exactly the moments Corwin needed them escalated, the whispered rumors that always seemed to reach exactly the right ears at exactly the right time. Every single piece finally clicked into place. Roran, once the full scope of the manipulation became clear, sought out Cale privately, away from the councils and the guards and the weight of 2 watching kingdoms. I believed you betrayed me, he said. For 7 years, I built a war on that belief. So did I, Cale admitted. About you. Neither man pretended the years of hatred simply evaporated with understanding. Too much had happened. Too many lives lost on both sides. Too many families broken by a conflict neither man had actually chosen for the reasons they'd believed. But something did shift between them in that conversation, something that hadn't existed in 7 years. Not friendship, not yet, but the possibility of it, which was more than either had allowed himself to hope for in a very long time. The final battle, when it came, wasn't between Ashmore and Draven at all. Word of Corwin's manipulation had spread through certain factions within both territories, older nobles who had built their own power on the war's continuation, who stood to lose everything if peace actually took hold between the two houses. A small but dangerous faction, drawing support from disaffected warriors on both sides who'd spent years profiting from conflict, attempted to seize control in the chaos following Corwin's exposure, hoping to keep the war alive by force if the two kings themselves seemed intent on ending it. That battle was different from anything either kingdom had fought in 7 years, because for the first time, Ashmore and Draven warriors stood on the same side of a battlefield, fighting not against each other, but against the forces trying to keep them divided. It was messy and costly, and nobody walked away from it unscathed. But it ended, decisively, with the war faction's leaders either captured or fled, and with both kingdoms understanding, in a way that mere words never could have accomplished, that the old hatred no longer served either of them. Leora watched that final battle from the palace walls, both children beside her, finally strong enough to stand on her own after weeks of healing. She'd spent 7 years running from exactly this kind of violence, terrified her children would grow up caught in the middle of it. Watching it end, watching both bloodlines finally fight for the same cause instead of against each other, was, by her own account later, the first time in nearly a decade she'd allowed herself to believe things might actually be different now. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments, because we're almost to the part where everything finally comes together. The complete truth, once fully assembled, answered every question that had haunted both courts for 7 years. The children weren't simply proof of a rare bloodline resurfacing by chance. Yselda's deeper research into the ancient archives eventually revealed that the old bloodline had a peculiar property tied to its dormancy. It tended to surface specifically in moments of profound crisis, as though the bloodline itself responded to exactly the kind of division and conflict that had once destroyed it generations earlier. The prophecy Yselda had found wasn't a prediction so much as a pattern, one that had apparently repeated itself before the current generation, though the details of those earlier occurrences had been lost to time. The twins, in other words, hadn't been born by accident into a war-torn moment. Something in their shared ancestry had responded to the very fracture between Ashmore and Draven, producing children capable of embodying both sides at once, as though the bloodline itself was attempting, in its own way, to heal a wound that had been left open for far too long. As for who had helped Leora those 7 years earlier, the mystery that had started the entire unraveling, the answer turned out to be simpler and sadder than anyone expected. It hadn't been a single benefactor working from noble motives. Corwin himself had arranged her escape, though not out of any kindness. He'd recognized, even then, the danger her pregnancy posed to his long game of keeping the two houses divided, and he'd calculated that removing her entirely from both territories would prevent either young Alpha from ever learning the truth. He'd nearly succeeded. Only the unexpected early shift of a frightened 7-year-old boy during a thunderstorm had unraveled 7 years of careful planning. The sacrifice, when it finally came to light, belonged to someone almost nobody had considered throughout the entire ordeal. The midwife who had helped deliver the triplets all those years ago, and who had lost her own family generations earlier to the very same conflict between the houses, had made a choice during that difficult birth that she'd carried silently for 7 years. The third infant, the girl who hadn't survived, had in fact been born healthy. The midwife, recognizing in that fragile household a woman already carrying an impossible burden, had made the agonizing decision to place that third child with a family in a distant territory who could offer her safety and a stable life, rather than risk her growing up hunted alongside her siblings, or worse, discovered and used as a political weapon by whichever house found her first. She'd told Leora the child had died, believing it kinder than the truth, believing Leora couldn't safely carry the burden of knowing a daughter was alive somewhere but permanently out of reach. That revelation, when Leora finally learned it, brought a grief different from the one she'd carried for 7 years. Not the grief of loss, but the almost unbearable ache of discovering that loss had been, in a strange way, a mercy she'd never asked for, and never gotten to choose for herself. The search for that third child became the final thread of this story, one that stretched well beyond the immediate crisis of exposed betrayal and ended wars. It would take months, following a trail gone cold with time, before Leora finally found her daughter, now 7 years old, raised in a loving family, who had no idea of her true origins. healthy and happy, and utterly unaware that an entire kingdom's fate had once hinged on the family that had given her away to save her life. That reunion, when it finally happened, wasn't simple or without pain, but it was, by every account from those present, worth every year it took to reach. We're almost at the end of this one. If it's kept you hooked this long, let us know in the comments which part hit you hardest. Peace between Ashmore and Draven didn't arrive overnight, and nobody pretended it would. 7 years of war leaves wounds that don't close simply because the truth finally comes out. There were funerals still to hold for those lost in the final battle against Corwin's faction. There were villages on both sides that had lost sons and daughters over the preceding years. Families who would need considerably longer than a formal treaty to trust that the fighting was truly finished. But the treaty came, eventually, signed not in some distant capital by representatives who had never met, but in the very courtyard where it had all begun, where Leora had collapsed 7 months earlier, where 2 Alpha Kings had stood ready to draw blood over children neither of them yet understood, where an old hatred built entirely on manipulation had finally been laid bare for what it always was. The twins, now 7, and beginning to grow into abilities nobody fully understood yet, stood at the center of that ceremony. Not as symbols exactly, though the crowds gathered from both territories certainly saw them that way, but as exactly what they'd always been underneath all the prophecy and politics. Children. 2 kids who had spent their whole short lives running from something they never chose to be part of, finally standing somewhere they were allowed to simply exist without fear. Cale and Roran signed that treaty together, the first joint agreement between Ashmore and Draven in over a decade, and whatever remained unresolved between the 2 men personally, the complicated tangle of old friendship, old grief over Leora, 7 years of genuine hatred that didn't simply vanish. None of it stopped them from recognizing, standing side by side in that courtyard, that their children deserved a future neither man's pride was worth sacrificing any further. Leora didn't marry either of them, in the end, though both courts spent considerable time speculating about exactly that outcome. She chose instead something neither kingdom's old traditions had a name for, an arrangement built on what actually mattered after everything they'd all survived together, rather than what either royal house's expectations demanded. Her children grew up knowing both fathers, both bloodlines, both territories, in a way that would have been impossible under the old hatred, and impossible, honestly, under most of the rigid traditions either kingdom still clung to in other matters. The third daughter, once found and slowly, carefully reintroduced to a family history she'd never known existed, chose in time to split her life between the family who'd raised her and the mother and siblings she was only just getting to know. Nobody rushed that process. Everyone involved understood, better than most, exactly how much damage came from forcing people into roles and relationships before they were ready. What this story leaves behind, once the treaties are signed and the crowns settle back into their proper places, is something worth sitting with for a while. Hatred, as it turned out, had survived between 2 good men for 7 long years, not because of anything true between them, but because someone else had built an entire war out of deception, patiently, one whispered lie at a time. And it took mercy, Roran's choice to protect a woman and children he had every reason to distrust, Cale's willingness to sit across from his greatest enemy and actually listen, to accomplish what 7 years of battle never managed to achieve. The children in this story never asked to carry the weight of their parents' war. No child ever does, and maybe that's the piece worth carrying with you longest after this story ends, that the conflicts we inherit, the grudges passed down and nursed for generations, rarely belong to the people forced to live inside them. Somebody, somewhere, always pays the price for hatred that outlives its original reason for existing. Sometimes it takes the truth arriving in the most unexpected way possible, collapsed at an enemy's feet, carrying an impossible proof that 2 sides were never as separate as they'd convinced themselves to believe, to finally set things right. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell us in the comments which moment hit hardest: the courtyard collapse, the betrayal, or the reunion at the end. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one still waiting to be told.